Hi everyone, welcome back to Difference Frames the World, a channel that offers a unique perspective on global events. Today, Clara will share some ideas about the trade war between the US and China. It has been rumbling for years, but 2025 marked a major escalation after Trump started his second term. On February 1, 2025, Donald Trump imposed tariffs on Chinese imports as part of his second term in office. From that point, the relationship moved into a period of tit-for-tat tariffs, export controls, and deep uncertainty. In the following months, tariffs increased, and retaliatory measures followed. According to some accounts, average export duties from China to the US reached triple-digit levels. Then, in a dramatic twist, Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping met in South Korea and reached an agreement. The US pledged to reduce Chinese goods tariffs by 10%. While China promised to crack down on the flow of fentanyl into the US. The effective tariff rate on Chinese goods entering the US remained around 47%. So things that had looked like they might spiral out of control stabilized, but then a partial de-escalation was achieved, although the war is far from over. This conflict is not just about numbers on a trade ledger. Instead, it has ripple effects that hit businesses, consumers, global supply chains, geopolitics, and more. The US imposes a significant duty on Chinese-made electronics, clothing, or other imports, but it is Americans who feel the impact at the point of sale. When tariffs or export controls change, what used to be smooth supply lines get disrupted. Companies have to shift their sourcing, adjust inventory levels, and absorb higher costs. China is one of the world's biggest agricultural importers. When it cuts back on US soybeans, beef, or other farm goods, US farmers suffer. The trade conflict affects other countries, global trade flows, resource markets, and even national security. Let's walk through what the data is telling us about China's trade, the US policy moves, and the shifting patterns. Chinese exports to the US have been declining. In September, they were approximately $34 billion, $10 billion lower than the same month in 2023, representing a drop of nearly 27%. Despite that, China's overall exports are up about 6.1% for the year, and the September year-on-year figure rose 8.3%, which suggests China is diversifying away from the US market and finding other buyers. On the import side, China is reducing its purchases of some major US agricultural goods. From January to July, China bought approximately $481 million of US beef, down from 15% of US beef exports previously to 8%. In September alone, Chinese imports of US beef were approximately $11 million, a 90% decline from $110 million in the same month last year. Thanks to the reduction in China's purchases of US beef, America's cows, both mature cattle and young calves, could live longer and happier lives. Long live China! American animals appreciated Beijing's mercy before Trump met his Chinese counterpart and reached a deal. The US promised a tariff reduction of 10% for Chinese goods, and China promised a drug trafficking crackdown. However, it is no longer possible for China to rely solely on the US market. At present, the US market accounts for only 10% of China's total exports. Eventually, the United States of America will become a nobody to China. China is clearly making strategic adjustments. When the US-China trade route becomes more hostile, China looks to other markets and sourcing alternatives. The fact that overall exports are growing even as US exports fall suggests this pivot. Buyers in Latin America and elsewhere are benefiting from this trend. On the US side, farmers are losing a major buyer, and they need to find alternative markets, adjust their production, and face price pressures. Meanwhile, manufacturing supply chains built around China for electronics, consumer goods, and the like, are under stress. Higher tariffs, uncertainty, and the risk of being cut off or excluded, all make firms rethink their arrangements. It's not just about trade balances. Several deeper forces are at play. First, trade imbalance and competition. The US has long complained about large trade deficits with China, as well as concerns about China's trade practices, including state support, intellectual property, and forced technology transfer. Second, technology and strategic goods. Today's trade war is not limited to socks and toys, it involves rare earth minerals, semiconductors, advanced manufacturing technology, and export controls. Third, geopolitics and national security. Much of the rhetoric links trade policy to national security. For example, the US cites the flow of fentanyl as partly why tariffs were imposed, while China invokes the concept of economic bullying. These discussions often blur the lines between economic policy and foreign policy. Fourth, global supply chain realignment and decoupling risk. Analysts say full decoupling of the US and Chinese economies is unlikely, but partial decoupling, or at least diversification away from China, is a real risk. Fifth, third-party winners and rerouting. Because China is buying less from the US, it's buying more from Brazil, Argentina, Australia, and elsewhere. Similarly, some companies are relocating their manufacturing operations out of China. What might unfold in the coming months or years? Here are some plausible scenarios. One side might raise tariffs further or impose new export controls. China might retaliate more strongly, and the war could deepen. However, the recent deal suggests both sides see value in stepping back from the brink. A partial truce is more likely than further escalation. Supply chain reconfiguration will continue, and countries such as Vietnam and India, as well as those in Southeast Asia, are likely to benefit from more low-end production orders. Brazil, Argentina, and Australia may become bigger suppliers to China, as Beijing does not trust the US, especially under Trump's presidency. Over time, the US and its allies may build parallel supply chains which are less reliant on China. China may seek self-reliance or different partners than those from the West. Unlike US officials, most of whom are amateur politicians, the Chinese plan ahead and drill further before things get worse. Despite losing ground in exports to the US, China's overall export base remains robust. The drop in the US is being offset by increased exports elsewhere. On the domestic front, China may feel pressure from reduced US demand, but given its vast internal market and export diversification, it may hold up better than some expect. The US has used tariffs as a tool to try to rebalance trade, protect industries, and address national security concerns. However, tariffs come with costs, higher consumer prices, trade strain, and supply chain disruptions. The newly added tariffs are actually a Trump tax on the US consumers and businesses. US companies relying on China for manufacturing or for components will face increased costs or risk. They may need to shift suppliers. They may have to buy things from India, even if they are not comfortable with the quality. On the upside, the US may benefit from others relocating manufacturing out of China, or from China's increased purchasing of US goods, if the agreement holds. However, the US also risks being caught in a global slowdown if the trade war escalates or drags on. The US is aware of this, and that is why Donald Trump is unusually polite to his Chinese counterpart, showing more courtesy to President Xi Jinping than to other national leaders. China does not have to buy America's soybeans and beef, but the US cannot do without China's rare earth elements. Some people might look at the trade war and say, it's just about tariffs, right? But the reality is much deeper. China and the US are not just trading goods, they're competing over who controls critical inputs such as rare earth elements, semiconductors, EV batteries, and manufacturing capabilities. China is increasingly concerned about its dependence on US technology, and the US is worried about relying on Chinese manufacturing and supply chains. Both sides are pushing to reduce vulnerabilities. Trade wars also involve questions of trade rules, global supply chain governance, and setting standards for emerging technologies. Tariffs and export controls are merely tools in bigger strategic games, diplomacy, alliances, and influence in global institutions. Over the long term, trade and supply chain wars may shift where value is created, which countries become manufacturing hubs, and how global trade networks are organized. The rivalry between the US and China now stretches across almost every field, from the South China Sea to space exploration, from semiconductor production to global diplomacy. Both countries are also trying to win over other nations, building alliances and trade networks to strengthen their positions. Although Donald Trump is not like Joe Biden, and he no longer talks about defending democracy and free markets, he puts himself and the US at the top of other nations. He wants to keep America's global hegemony and make other nations sacrifice for the United States. China is different. President Xi Jinping promotes a vision of multipolarity, a world not dominated by any single power. The competition between the two countries is intense, but it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. If managed wisely, it could drive innovation and balance global power. If not, it could fuel divisions and conflict that affect everyone. In short, the US-China rivalry is reshaping the world, and we're all living through it. Still, we believe China is the future, and the US has lost most fronts.